Israel keeps relentlessly dismantling Iran's missile capabilities. Just this morning, it wiped out 35 launchers, along with several missile storage sites.
Fighter jets destroyed 35 missile launchers. Storage sites in Iran this morning, IDF says.
In fact, according to Israel, and this is extremely important, Iran has already lost more than half of its missile launch capacity, something that is clearly making the Black Turban regime increasingly nervous. The Ayatollah's position is becoming more fragile, which may explain why recent attacks against Israel have become far more indiscriminate. For example, just yesterday, Iran crossed a terrible line that Israel will no doubt make them pay for very soon. I'm talking about the ballistic missile that struck Soroka Hospital in Be'er Sheva, the largest hospital in the entire southern half of the Israeli state.
Iran's terrorist tyrants launched missiles at Soroka Hospital in Beersheba and at a civilian population in the center of the country. We will exact the full price from the tyrants in Tehran.
You see, Netanyahu is now promising an even bigger dose of revenge. In fact, he's already in the midst of it. In the last few hours, the home of another nuclear program scientist in Tehran has been attacked with drones. And Israel's defense minister has gone so far as to say that Khomeini can no longer exist because he is basically the modern Hitler. That's where things stand. With full control of Tehran's skies and the entire western half of the country, they can pretty much do whatever they want. They can take out more government buildings or hit Iran's economy even harder by destroying oil and gas facilities. There are plenty of options on the table because attacks like this one on the hospital only give Israel the green light for any kind of retaliation. In any case, the Israelis will keep doing what they're doing, taking out defenses, missile systems, and pretty much anything tied to Iran's military or intelligence apparatus. Like we said before, they won't stop until the job is done. Speaking of these attacks, just a couple of days ago, Israel destroyed the headquarters of Iran's public security police. Many people brushed off this strike as just another one of the 1,100 targets Israel claims to have hit since the start of the operation. But this one was different. It wasn't directly tied to any immediate threat against Israel. Blowing up that building might actually be more significant than it seems. In a way, it sends a direct message to Iranians. Israel isn't just targeting the Ayatollah's military threats, it's also going after the regime's social control structures. Why? Well, there are various theories, but many analysts believe that by attacking these kinds of targets, Israel is trying to encourage an uprising among the Iranian people. In other words, to break the population's fear of protesting and destabilize the Ayatollah's grip on power. In fact, just yesterday, something else happened that might suggest this strategy is already in motion. Take a look.
Iran blames Israel for hacking state TV broadcast with calls for uprising.
Pro-Israeli hackers managed to take control of the broadcasting of several Iranian television channels, while at the same time, images of women's protests and messages urging people to take to the streets began to appear on television. And this, on top of what we've just told you, can suggest something more. Israel might also be trying to create the right conditions to spark a reaction from the Iranian people themselves against the Ayatollah's theocratic regime. An uprising could be the only possible way to try to force a regime change, because evidently neither Israel, nor the United States, nor any other country will even consider deploying a single soldier on the ground apart from covert operations. Therefore, for the regime to fall, the Iranians need to mobilize. Along these lines, Reza Pahlavi himself, the son of the Shah overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, has said he's ready to lead a provisional government and that there's already a plan in place.
ایران دچار جنگ داخلی و بی‌ثباتی نخواهد شد. ما برای آینده ایران و شکوفایی‌اش برنامه داریم. ما برای 100 روز نخست پس از سقوط، دوران گذار و استقرار یک حکومت ملی و دموکراتیک.
But there's one thing to keep in mind here, and that is that Pahlavi's words, the supposed crown prince, could scare off many Iranians rather than ignite a real social revolution. Why? Most Iranians aren't willing to risk their lives in the streets just to restore someone who's basically the heir of a short-lived and brutally repressive monarchy. It happens that his father, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was a dictator who built a ruthless, repressive machine and a massive corruption network that stole billions of dollars. In the end, that regime fueled the Iranian Revolution, which, while originally mostly secular, was hijacked by the religious minority who installed the theocracy that we see today. And let's not forget that his grandfather was even an ally of the Nazis. So, no matter how often his name comes up, honestly, it doesn't seem like this man represents what most Iranians want for their future. Now, apart from this so-called crown prince, is a regime change in Iran actually possible? How could such a change happen? And what would it mean if the United States joins Israel's offensive? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down in this video, so pay close attention.
Israel leveling the ground?
It is no surprise that one of Israel's main targets when it launched its first massive attack on the 13th of June was precisely Iran's top leadership. In other words, the regime's military leadership. As soon as the offensive began, Chief of Staff Bagheri, Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Guards Hossein Salami, and Revolutionary Guards Intelligence Chief Kazemi were dealt the same fate that Israel had already prepared for Hezbollah leaders in Lebanon last year. That is to say, a one-way trip to the afterlife. And that's not all. Israel has also sent a message loud and clear. Anyone who fills these new positions will suffer the same fate. This is what has in fact happened with Ali Shadmani, who took over as Chief of Staff and was killed after just 4 days.
Israel kills Iran's new war chief days after taking out predecessor as strikes continue.
The operation to take down the ringleaders is clearly aimed at 3 aspects. First, repress Iran's military capabilities. Second, revenge. You know, if you mess with Israel, sooner or later, you'll pay for it. Because in the end, they've all been complicit in the attacks Israel has suffered in recent years, from Hezbollah's ongoing aggressions to the insane October 7th attack carried out by Hamas. And finally, many analysts believe this targeted and surgical elimination campaign might actually be part of a broader strategy to destabilize the power structure from within. This could, in a way, call into question the regime itself. This becomes even more relevant considering that Israel seems to have allies or collaborators embedded within the regime's own ranks. So, taking out the hostile top brass could be an effective way to ignite fierce internal power struggles. At the same time, it sends a clear message to the Iranian people. Don't fear these tyrants. Their days are numbered. In fact, it looks like this time, Israel is playing a different game, reaching out directly to the Iranian people, encouraging them to break free from their chains and spark a popular uprising that could ultimately bring down a regime already badly battered by this confrontation. And keep a close eye on this, because if there's one thing Netanyahu has proven over the years, it's that he knows how to play 5-dimensional chess. And keep in mind that Iranian civil society isn't exactly fond of the regime. During the massive protests of 2022 and 2023, sparked by women's rights and the worsening economy, the regime's repressive apparatus went after the demonstrators as things escalated quickly. They didn't just use tear gas, water cannons, and heavy-handed beatings to disperse protesters. They also fired live ammunition at anyone brave enough to stand up to them. There are even suspicions that the regime used chemical weapons in schools, where students, most of them young women, were protesting against this oppressive regime. That's why, beyond simply targeting internal security forces as punishment, much of what Israel is doing could actually be seen as a message of support to the Iranian people. But of course, as you can imagine, Iran's repressive network extends far beyond the security headquarters the Israelis have now blown to smithereens. The truth is, the grip of the Islamic Revolution reaches into nearly every corner of the country. And here's the question: how exactly is this repressive machine organized? Well, while the police, under the Ministry of the Interior, is one of the regime's main tools, the Ayatollah controls 2 additional forces specifically designed to crush any hint of dissent. The most important, Police Command of the Islamic Republic of Iran, sometimes abbreviated to Faraja or Naja.
This is a force of between 100,000 and 200,000 personnel, with an additional 100,000 staff working in affiliated organizations, such as the Police Electronic Services Office. The NIOA not only has a headquarters in each province of the country that controls the activity of all provincial police stations, but also disciplinary districts in each city to crush any subversive activity.
And that's not all. To support the Naja, there is even a paramilitary militia made up of volunteers called the Basij. And take note, because with around 5 million members, active and inactive, in the entire world. In other words, no matter how much Israel has attacked Iran's internal security headquarters, the reality is that the repressive apparatus is still enormous, something that Israel is obviously aware of. So, could we perhaps start seeing news in a few days of Israeli attacks against these structures? Well, it's not far-fetched. In fact, if indeed Israel really wants to facilitate facilitate a civil uprising, as in a way they are saying, it would be essential to attack these spaces. Time will tell whether or not that's the way things are going. Then there's another move that some believe, while risky, could deal a final blow to the government and further escalate tensions. I'm talking about targeting the energy infrastructure. For now, Netanyahu is holding back in this area. In a moment, I'll explain a bit more about why. For now, they have limited themselves to hitting 2 oil and 2 gas facilities. For many, these have been warning strikes aimed at telling the Ayatollahs, careful, we've got your golden goose in our crosshairs, the very one that funds your missile attacks and nuclear program. But according to some experts and strategists, striking these infrastructure facilities wouldn't just deal an economic blow to the government, it could also trigger betrayals at the highest levels of power to protect that golden goose and fuel public unrest. Because in this country, much of the civilian population does blame the government for their hardships, and when it comes to energy, things are heating up. The energy issue has already sparked major protests against the regime in recent years, and some believe it could be used as a political pressure point. In fact, just take a look at what happened not long ago, at the end of May.
Iranians complain of blackouts, water cuts as power crisis deepens.
Of course, it could also backfire, worsening the view that many Iranians have of the Israeli operation, which, despite everything, is believed to have a fair amount of quiet support inside the country. Just look at Ukraine, for example. We've seen how energy blackmail didn't turn Ukrainians against their government, but instead united them even more to defend themselves against Moscow. Still, since energy is such a sensitive topic in Iran, there's some uncertainty, because if the regime loses its main source of foreign currency, that could trigger betrayals and embolden opposition groups. In short, the regime would start to suffocate financially. But for now, Israel is holding back from attacking these types of infrastructure. Why? Well, the reason may have a lot to do with this. In 2024, Iran exported over 90% of all its oil and also most of its gas to a single country. Any idea who that buyer was? 3, 2, 1. Exactly, China. So if Israel jeopardizes this supply, Beijing might get annoyed and seek to actively support Tehran, which obviously is the last thing Israel needs right now. And yes, even an attack on the electrical system could affect supply. But either way, that option is still there. Because, like I said, Iranian society has been suffering through a severe crisis for years, for which the government is unhesitatingly and overwhelmingly to blame. For example, apart from the constant blackouts, Iran has been stuck in a seemingly endless inflation crisis. Since 2018, annual inflation has averaged around 30%, which has fueled a dramatic rise in poverty. In other words, Iranian society was already fed up with the Ayatollahs, and now Israel might be stirring the pot even more. How? Well, like I said, by targeting the regime's repressive apparatus and possibly also hitting certain strategic infrastructure. At least, that seems to be what some Israeli strategists are floating around. But of course, it's far from simple. So let's take a closer look at why. And while we're at it, let's also answer some lingering questions. Is the regime really that isolated? Is there a real alternative to the Ayatollah's grip on power? And perhaps most importantly, if Israeli airstrikes continue, could they actually backfire and end up strengthening popular support for the regime? Well, let's find out.
It won't be that easy.
Let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered about the meaning behind the name Israel has given to this military operation? You know, Operation Rising Lion? You see, this name is a direct reference to Iran's ancient imperial emblem, the Lion of the Sun, which was used prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Today, that lion is displayed on the green, white, and red flags of the Iranian community in exile. And not surprisingly, it also appears every time there's a protest, whether in Shiraz or Los Angeles. In other words, Israel is stirring up the memory of ancient Persia to contrast it with the black turban of the Ayatollahs. Well, many see this move as nothing more than a provocation, but others view it as a signal, a message that Iran could have a different future, and that if the people take to the streets, Israel would back them by striking regime targets. Now, how realistic is it to think that there could actually be a regime change? Is that even a real possibility? Well, let's break it down. First of all, as we've just explained, the initial blow has been brutal. We're not just talking about material or military losses, but real cracks within the top leadership. Iranians know this better than anyone, which is why you've probably seen tons of videos of people shouting "Death to Khamenei," for now from the safety of their homes. And given the economic crisis, repression, and now bombings that are a direct consequence of the government's foreign policy, you can imagine how people are feeling. For a long time, the regime held onto power thanks to support from various sectors, the lower classes, rural populations, and even some young idealists. But over time, that support has collapsed. Of course, there are no official statistics on this, but recent surveys suggest that in 46 years, the regime has lost almost every group that once backed it, leaving behind just a hardcore of around 8 million people in a country totaling over 90 million. In other words, barely 10% of the population. That's the true base of the Ayatollahs. People who either genuinely believe in the Islamic regime or simply depend on it for their livelihoods. And that's it. That's the extent of the real power of the Black Turbans. And to really understand this downfall of the Islamic system, we need to take a quick look back in time.
Since 1979, the regime has gone through several phases of attrition. First, it lost the modern and urban class, with the so-called Cultural Revolution, in which Khomeini eliminated all Western and pre-Islamic influences. It then lost the liberal middle classes, especially since the harsh repression during the 2009 protests. Later, the weariness reached even the rural working class, the Great Forgotten, which in 2017 and 2019 took to the streets in cities such as Qom and Mashhad. Protests that, by the way, were crushed with brutal violence. And then came 2019, when the regime killed more than 1,500 protesters in just a few weeks of protests.
In other words, the foundation of the regime had already been shaking in recent times. Iranians are fully aware of the disaster that the Ayatollah's tyranny has brought upon them, and this is precisely when Israel's attack came in. As we've mentioned, many strategists believe this move could eventually lead to regime change, something that could be further encouraged if the United States gets involved, because that could directly corner the regime. However, many others believe the exact opposite could happen. Take a look.
Israel tried to break Iran, but it may have actually helped unite it. Instead of deepening divisions, the Israeli assault appears to be reinforcing a shared sense of national identity across political lines.
And this is where Netanyahu's plan could be put at a critical juncture. Put another way, scaling up more than necessary could be counterproductive. Now then, if a social uprising were to ultimately bring down the Ayatollahs, then what comes next? Well, this is where a big dilemma arises. Because even though many would celebrate it, the fall of the regime wouldn't automatically lead to democracy or anything like it. In fact, it could even open the door to an even harsher regime. Yeah, you heard correctly.
Regime change would be unlikely to bring democracy to Iran. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the most likely political institution to take control if the clerical elite were removed.
And obviously, whoever has more armed, economic, and political power after the supreme leader is the one who has the most chances to start commanding. And in this case, we're talking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. This organization not only has tanks, missiles, soldiers, and a lot of repressive operations all over the country, it also controls a major part of the economy. It has ghost companies, parallel commercial networks, and what's more, command cadres who are ideologically quite radical. If tomorrow, for whatever reason, Khomeini were to disappear, it could be the Revolutionary Guard itself that would put pressure on the assembly of experts to elect a new supreme leader equal to, or more radical than, Khomeini. So yes, there could be a revolution, but that doesn't mean that freedom is assured. Far from it. The Iranian regime has been struck where it hurts the most: its ideological base, its elite military forces, and its internal prestige. Israel has executed surgical strikes, weakening Iran militarily and demoralizing its most loyal supporters. And yes, for the first time in decades, even some of the most radical factions are starting to question the system itself. But let's be honest, just because the regime might collapse doesn't automatically mean the future will be better. In Iran, the all-powerful Revolutionary Guard still holds a firm grip over civil society. The Israelis can keep trying to weaken them further, but most experts agree, without a major internal power struggle, it's far from certain that the Iranian regime will actually fall. Of course, only time will tell. But for now, the questions are over to you. Are we witnessing the Ayatollah's countdown, or the prelude to an even harsher military dictatorship? Drop your thoughts down in the comments and let's open up the debate. And, very important, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. It's really quick, it's free, and it helps us out a ton. Thank you so much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.